$7 billion was supposed to be safe. That was the promise. Not risky tech stocks, not crypto, not some complicated Wall Street product, just certificates of deposit. The kind of investment many people associate with safety, stability, and sleep-at-night money. But prosecutors said Stanford Financial was hiding something much darker. Behind the polished offices, private banking image, and confident promises, investors were not looking at a safe investment machine. They were looking at one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history. This is the story of Stanford Financial, a financial empire that sold trust, a bank that promised safety, and a $7 billion fraud that showed how dangerous the word safe can become when the people selling it are lying. Allen Stanford did not present himself like a small-time scammer. He looked wealthy. He looked connected. He looked global. He built an image around private banking, international finance, sports sponsorships, and elite credibility. That image mattered because Ponzi schemes do not survive only on math. They survive on belief. People have to believe the person. They have to believe the brand. They have to believe the story. And Stanford Financial had a very powerful story. The company offered certificates of deposit through Stanford International Bank, an offshore bank based in Antigua. To ordinary investors, the product sounded conservative. A certificate of deposit sounds boring, and boring can feel safe. That was part of the danger, because the safer something sounds, the less people may question it. Investors were told their money would be placed into a carefully managed investment portfolio. They were told the bank was strong. They were told the strategy was conservative. They were told the returns were reliable. But according to the indictment, Stanford and his co-defendants engaged in a scheme to defraud investors who bought approximately $7 billion in CDs administered by Stanford International Bank. That is the key mechanism. Investors thought they were buying safety. Prosecutors said they were funding a fraud. The promise was simple. Give Stanford International Bank your money. Receive a CD. Earn attractive returns. Trust the institution. But the question every investor should ask is this: how can a bank pay unusually strong returns while still claiming the investment is low risk? That is where the Stanford story starts to break. Because in finance, return and risk are usually connected. Higher return usually means higher risk. If someone promises strong returns with low risk, that does not automatically mean fraud. But it does mean the explanation needs to be very clear. Where is the money invested? Who controls it? Who verifies it? What happens if investors want their money back? In the Stanford case, prosecutors said the answers were not what investors were led to believe. The CD money was allegedly not managed the way investors were told. Instead of a transparent, conservative portfolio, the money was allegedly misused, misrepresented, and used to keep the operation alive. That is how a Ponzi structure works. New investor money helps pay earlier investors. The system looks stable as long as money keeps coming in. People receive payments. Statements look normal. Sales teams keep selling. Confidence stays alive. But underneath the surface, the machine depends on fresh cash. Not real sustainable profits. Fresh cash. And once fresh cash slows down, the illusion becomes harder to maintain. This is why Ponzi schemes are so dangerous. They can look successful for a long time. The victims may even believe the investment is working because they receive statements and payments. The fraud creates its own evidence. A payment arrives, so the investor believes the system is real. A statement shows a balance, so the investor believes the money exists. A salesperson sounds confident, so the investor believes the institution is strong. But confidence is not custody. A statement is not proof. A brand is not protection. And a wealthy-looking founder is not a risk control. Stanford Financial sold more than an investment product. It sold an identity, private banking, international sophistication, exclusive access, a financial world that looked stable from the outside. That image helped reduce suspicion. Because when people see polished offices, professional employees, impressive marketing, and wealthy leadership, their guard can drop. They think, this must be legitimate. But fraud does not always look messy. Sometimes fraud wears a suit. Sometimes fraud has a beautiful office. Sometimes fraud sponsors events. Sometimes fraud looks more professional than the honest companies. That was the power of the Stanford image. The company did not need to look desperate. It needed to look inevitable. It needed to look like a place where smart people put serious money. And for years, that image worked. Thousands of investors trusted the system. Many believed they were protecting their savings, not gambling with them. That is what makes this case so painful. A Ponzi scheme is not just a financial crime. It is a betrayal of trust. People are not only losing money, they are losing the belief that the people advising them were protecting them. They are losing years of savings. They are losing retirement security. They are losing peace. And that is why these crimes leave damage long after the headlines fade. The Stanford scheme also shows how dangerous offshore complexity can become. Stanford International Bank was based in Antigua. For investors, that offshore structure may have sounded sophisticated, but offshore structures can make verification harder. They can create distance between the investor and the real money. They can make oversight more complicated. They can make the whole operation feel elite while also making it harder to understand. And when an investor does not fully understand where the money is, who controls it, or how returns are generated, the risk goes way up. That does not mean every offshore structure is fraudulent, but it does mean the burden of proof should be higher. In a clean system, the investor should not need blind faith. They should have clear custody, clear reporting, clear independent verification, clear regulation, clear answers. When those answers are vague, the red flags start blinking. Stanford Financial also used a classic fraud advantage. The product sounded simple, but the operation behind it was hard to see. That gap is dangerous. The investor hears, certificate of deposit. The investor thinks, safe, but behind that phrase, the money may be moving through entities, accounts, loans, and internal structures the investor never sees. That is how simple language can hide complex risk. The phrase, CD, lowered fear. The offshore bank increased mystery. The Stanford brand filled the gap with confidence. But confidence is not the same as truth. By 2009, the pressure around the financial system was already extreme. The world had just lived through the financial crisis. Madoff had been exposed. Investors were scared. Regulators were watching. And suddenly, the Stanford empire came under direct scrutiny. The SEC charged Allen Stanford and related parties with operating a massive fraud. The FBI announced charges in what it described as a $7 billion Ponzi scheme. The government alleged that investor money had been misrepresented and misused. And the image that Stanford Financial had built began to collapse. When a Ponzi scheme breaks, it does not break gently. It breaks trust all at once. The thing that looked stable yesterday looks impossible today. The statements people trusted become suspect. The returns people celebrated become part of the evidence. The brand that gave people comfort becomes the thing they regret trusting. That is the brutal moment in every Ponzi collapse. The investor realizes the safety was the sales pitch, not the reality. Allen Stanford was later convicted and sentenced to 110 years in prison. That sentence reflected the scale of the harm. This was not a small accounting error. This was not a bad investment that simply went wrong. This was a system that prosecutors said defrauded people who believed their money was safe. And the human cost was enormous. People had saved for decades. People believed they were protecting their families. People trusted the institution. Then the foundation cracked underneath them. The psychology of this collapse is important. Stanford Financial worked because it did not feel like a reckless bet. It felt like protection. The fraudster does not just sell returns. The fraudster sells relief. Relief from worry. Relief from market volatility. Relief from uncertainty. And that emotional relief is powerful. Investors want to believe there is a place where their money can grow without fear. That desire is human, but fraud exploits human desire. It exploits the desire for peace, the desire for certainty, the desire to trust someone else with complexity. And once that trust is captured, the fraud has room to grow. Stanford's case also teaches a major lesson about yield. If an investment offers better returns than normal safe products, the question is not, how do I get in? The question is, why does this return exist? Because real investing requires boring questions. Fraud hates boring questions. Fraud wants excitement, trust, urgency, and image. Fraud wants investors to focus on the promise, not the plumbing. But the plumbing is where the truth lives. Who controls the cash? Where are the assets? Who confirms the balances? Who audits the books? Who has the power to say no? Those questions can save people from disaster. For creators, investors, and business people, Stanford Financial is a case study in brand risk. A strong brand can create trust, but a strong brand can also become camouflage. The more impressive the image, the more carefully people should inspect the substance. Stanford Financial also shows why Ponzi schemes often grow so large. The longer they last, the more legitimate they appear. Every year without collapse becomes part of the sales pitch. People say, they have been around for years, but longevity is not proof of honesty. A fraud can survive for years if enough new money keeps entering the system. Time can make people less suspicious, not more. That is the paradox. The longer the fraud survives, the safer it may look, until the day it fails. And when it fails, the age of the operation does not protect anyone. It only proves how long the illusion lasted. In the end, Stanford Financial was not just a story about one man. It was a story about trust without verification. It was a story about safe language, hiding unsafe reality. It was a story about investors believing they were buying protection when prosecutors said they were funding a massive fraud. And it was a story about how professional presentation can make dangerous products look harmless. That is why this case still matters. Because the next big fraud may not look like fraud. It may look safe. It may look polished. It may look conservative. It may use words people already trust. Bank, deposit, private client, guaranteed, stable, exclusive. But the real question is not how safe the product sounds. The real question is whether the safety can be proven. Stanford Financial sold the feeling of security. But when investigators looked behind the image, the structure collapsed. And the lesson is simple. Never let a polished brand replace proof. Never let strong returns override basic questions. Never let the word safe turn off your brain. Because in the Stanford case, the investment that sounded boring became a $7 billion disaster. And for thousands of investors, the promise of safety became the beginning of the loss. If you want more corporate collapse and financial fraud breakdowns, subscribe to the channel. And watch the next video, because Stanford was not the only financial empire that used trust as its most powerful weapon.